Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. My name is Kevin Brooks, and this is going to be a quick video tutorial on how to animate type in After Effects. Alright, so as you guys can see, this is the project we will be making. It just says a short introductory to animated typography. And to begin, let's start off by creating a new composition by going up here to the menu bar and clicking Composition, New Composition. You can also swing down here to the project panel and right-click to select New Composition. In the settings window that pops up, you can name your composition, select a video preset, change the frame rate, and set the length of the composition. This is your hours, minutes, seconds, and frames, and then select a working background color and click OK. Since the background color is just like a replacement for transparency, let's come down here to the Layers panel besides the timeline and right-click to select New Solid. After we make sure it matches the composition size, click OK, and since this is a static background, the quickest way to add some depth or flare is to go over here to the Effects and Presets tab and type in Ramp into the search box. Ramp is just After Effects word for two-color gradient, and from here you can click and drag the effect onto the composition window, or if you want to be more precise, you can drop it onto the layer in the timeline. After that, you can come up here next to the project panel to find the Effect Controls panel where you can edit the properties of the chosen effect. I'm going to start by changing this to a radial gradient and moving the starting point of the ramp down to the center of the composition, and then I'm going to change the colors. Once the colors are set, we'll drag the ending point of the ramp to be somewhere off stage to give it a smoother appearance. We can come up here to the Type tool now, which you can also get to by pressing Command-T on your keyboard or Control-T if you have a Windows PC, and we can click on the composition window to start typing. Let's come back up here and select the mouse tool, or you can hit V on your keyboard, and we're just going to move the text right into place here. Another way to create a text layer is to come down here to the Layers panel again and right-click to select New Text, which will position the text in the center of the stage, and without having to click anything else, we can begin typing. Select the mouse tool again to move the layer, and we're just going to repeat this process until everything else falls into place. This looks about right, so now we can come down here and select the A Short layer and click on this little drop down arrow next to the layer to reveal its properties, and then again next to the transform property. Before we go any further though, make sure we're at the starting point on the timeline or the starting frame, and let's drag this layer off stage. This way, when the video begins, the layer will be off screen before coming into focus. So we're going to set it about here, and let's create a keyframe for it. Clicking the stopwatch icon is how you create a keyframe, and a keyframe tells After Effects what information to save and at what frame on the timeline. So we're going to create a keyframe for the position and one for opacity, and let's change the opacity to 0 so that the layer fades in as it comes on screen. Moving ahead about a second and a half on the timeline, we're going to change the opacity back to 100%, and just by doing that, we have created a new keyframe for this layer, because when you change a property that already has a keyframe somewhere else on the timeline, if you aren't on the exact frame as the existing keyframe, After Effects will create a new one wherever your scrubber is at on the timeline. Moving on, let's drag this layer back on stage to create a new keyframe for the layer's position. To create the R, we're going to duplicate this layer by hitting Command-D on your keyboard, Control-D for Windows. Duplicating a layer lets it retain all of its keyframes and other properties, so this will save us from having to recreate that fade-in effect for this new R. Double-click now on this duplicated layer to edit the text, and we're going to replace it all with just the letter R. Select the mouse tool again to move it into place above the pre-existing R in short, and you can either do this by clicking and dragging the position amount, or by zooming in and shift-clicking to move the R in a straight line. So if we go back in time, however, we'll notice that the R's don't match up anymore, so what we're going to have to do is change the starting position of the R back on the first frame of the video. Let's move the position of the R over to the right at about the same amount as we had earlier when we moved it to cover the existing R in short. I kept track with the calculator earlier to save some time, so I'm just going to change the position here and it should match up. Thankfully it does match up, so let's come back down here to the A short layer and double click to edit the type. We're just going to highlight the R and we're going to change the fill to none and the outline to black. We can do this by clicking this little curved arrow over here in the character panel to swap the fill and stroke colors. Now you won't be able to see this just yet as this layer is beneath that R layer, so let's come back to that individual R layer and make it 3D by clicking this little cube here next to the layer name. If your screen doesn't look like mine, you can come down here to the bottom left of the program window to find these three little buttons. This first one is the Layer Switches pane, which holds that 3D checkbox, and next to it is the Transfer Controls pane, which holds the Alpha Track Matte options, and lastly is the In and Out pane. Going back to where we left off, the reason we made this R layer 3D was to get access to these editable XYZ properties. We're going to create a keyframe for the Y rotation, and your Y axis is what lets your layer twist right and left like so. Now that our keyframe is made, let's advance a few frames and change our Y rotation to be at about 90 degrees to create another keyframe. Let's also create another keyframe for position by clicking this little diamond here, and this way when we finish the R's rotation and drop it down, it doesn't start dropping down until it has reached that 90-degree Y rotation. So come forward about a second again on the timeline and change the Y rotation to 1x or 1 full rotation, and now we can start to drop the R down to line it up with the R in introductory. You can do this by selecting the mouse tool again and using the sliders for the position property to shimmy it into place. So let's scrub back in time a second to see how it looks, and that seems to fall in place pretty well. Let's select the introductory layer now, open the drop downs, and for this one we're going to change the opacity to 0 just before the R starts to drop and create a keyframe. We'll bring the opacity back up at about the same time the R finishes dropping, and in order to hide that R that already exists in the word introductory, we're going to create a mask by right-clicking on the layer name and selecting Mask, New Mask. This yellow bounding box is your mask, and in order to resize it, we have to double-click on it, and then we can click and drag to transform it. As we drag it back, you'll notice that everything outside of the mask is invisible on stage. So once your mask box is resized, hit Enter on your keyboard to finish the transformation, and if you come down here to the Layers panel again, you'll see that we got an additional property for masks. So click the drop-down arrow to reveal the mask layer we just made, make sure it's selected, and hit Command D on your keyboard to duplicate it. Make sure the second mask is highlighted, and then we're going to come back up here to the composition window and drag this second mask over past the R. Double-click to resize it, and let's get it to cover the rest of the word introductory. You can zoom in to be a little more precise with it, and then we can hit Enter on the keyboard to set the transformation. Let's see how this looks now. So we can see that the R on this layer is now hidden, but it doesn't affect the other R layer as it drops down into place. Come forward a few frames and let's begin our next animation. Select the drop-down arrow next to the To Animated layer, and this time we're going to click on the little button arrow next to the word Animate, and we're going to animate the scale. This brings us a new drop-down under the Text tab, not the Transform tab. So if you end up running into problems with this, make sure you're under the Text tab and not the Transform tab. We also see the Range Selector and Scale option here now, so let's create a keyframe for scale and set it to 0. Scrub forward about a second on the timeline and let's bring the scale back up to 100%. This is technically done by the Range Selector here, which allows this layer to scale up by the individual letter, and you'll see these little secondary anchor points, which are these tiny little X's under the letters. In order to create this over animation effect, let's open the Range Selector and expand its Advanced Property list. Going back to the start of this animation, let's create a keyframe for the amount property, and then come back to the end of the animation again and create another keyframe for the amount property, this time by changing it to -100%. So between the amount percentage and the scale animation, this is what gives that nice little bit of an over animation effect before the layer settles back into full size or full scale. So we're going to continue by skipping forward a few frames before we begin to animate this last layer. We're going to open up the drop down for this layer, expand the transform properties, and change the layer to 3D so we can access those XYZ rotations again. We're going to create keyframes for position, X rotation, and opacity. Your X rotation is what makes your layer look like it is either falling forwards or backwards, so for this keyframe, let's set it to fall back at -90 degrees. We're going to change the opacity to 0 and drop the position down slightly. We're going to scrub forward a second on the timeline again, and let's bring those properties back to normal. We'll change the X rotation back to 0, the opacity back to 100%, and let's float the position back up to about where we had it last. Let's ram preview to see how it goes. Awesome. Looks like it came out great. Well, everyone, definitely be sure to mess around with some of the properties we covered today, such as the range selector and the mask options, as they're a whole lot of fun and will become a huge help later on down the road. Let me just thank you all so much for watching this video today. My name is Kevin Brooks, and this has been a simple tutorial on how to animate type in Adobe After Effects CS6. I'd like to make more videos like this, so please drop me a line in the comments section below to let me know how I did, and be sure to tune in again next time. Thanks everyone, see you later.